Tonight, it was a terrible, senseless murder. Both offenders were equally to blame and both were set the same sentence, but that's where the similarities ended. What happened next is a dramatic example of political interference in our legal system, possibly only in this state. The Rann government quietly set one murderer free while bragging publicly, keeping the other one safely locked away. Graham Archer has our investigation.
People have lost all faith in the hope of equal treatment under the law.
Come on.
It has to be fair, it has to be open, it has to be transparent, and it has to be judicial.
Michael Peter Webb and Veronica Jane Hay, you have both been found guilty of the crime of murder.
What makes us all equal before the law is the independent exercise of the law itself.
Unfortunately, what we're seeing is politicians undermining that independence and using that for their own political means.
The law provides the sentence for murder. It is life imprisonment. I fix a non-parole period of 20 years.
In September 1992, Michael Webb and Veronica Hay were found guilty of the brutal and unprovoked killing of drinking partner Lance Patrick.
34-year-old Lance Patrick's semi-naked body was discovered in a supermarket car park.
On the night of Monday, 12th of August 1991, Webb, 28, and Hay, 23, were drinking at a Mount Gambier hotel.
Cheers.
They were joined by truck driver Lance Patrick. The three continued to drink as they played ball. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Patrick bought a cask of Moselle and the three left the pub and made their way to a nearby bus shelter where they continued drinking. Their conduct became increasingly raucous, and around midnight, Webb and Hay, for reasons unclear, set upon their companion, beating and kicking him to the ground and then killing him by stamping on his throat. The shoe prints left on his body matched the footwear worn by both Webb and Hay.
You are therefore both implicated. You should both bear equal responsibility.
The two assailants then stole their victim's boots and jacket and abandoned his lifeless body.
The acts of kicking and stamping upon a defenceless man lying unconscious on the ground show the intention by you both to inflict at least grievous bodily harm upon him.
At the end of his sentencing, Trial Judge Justice Bruce DeBell made these final remarks.
The effect of what I have ordered is that with remissions for good conduct, you will both be eligible for release in about 13.5 years.
Hay is Aboriginal, Webb Samoan. Both pleaded not guilty, both were convicted. Both received identical sentences and the same non-parole period. Their treatment should have been equal, but it hasn't been. 19 years on, Veronica Hay has been out of jail for 6 years. Michael Webb is still locked behind bars.
Does that outcome make sense to you?
No, it doesn't at all.
Francis Nelson QC has been the presiding officer of the SA Parole Board for 29 years and is particularly disturbed by this case.
There was no reason to say Ms Hay was more meritorious than Mr Webb. And so I do think that unless there's something that's escaped me, that it was a very unfair situation.
One was released, the other is still in jail 6 years later.
That's right.
They both participated willingly, and the only difference between either of them is that one knew an influential politician and the other one didn't.
There could hardly be a more dramatic example of how unequally people in this state can be treated.
Well, it's a hangover from the last century, and all the other states in Australia have done away with this particular law and have moved on to create a fairer and more just system.
But not South Australia?
But not South Australia, no.
Only in South Australia can the Executive Council of Government, made up of the Premier, the Attorney-General and other ministers, decide which prisoners on life sentences get parole and which don't.
You know, it would appear as a possible way of interfering with the judicial process in...
Well, that is the practical effect of that sort of decision. Whether that's the intention, I can't say because I don't know, but I know that is the effect.
No reasons are given, nothing in writing, no explanation. It's just their decision and that's the end of the story.
MLC Anne Bressington says this opens the door to manipulation and unfairness, as appears to have happened in this case.
If you don't have any contacts, then you could literally rot for the rest of your days in jail. And that's not justice. That's not even law and order. That's a system that's open to abuse.
While there's no criticism of Veronica Hay, she was fortunate to have supporters Webb did not. They happened to be influential in the local Aboriginal community and in turn had political connections.
Well, it's my information that a former president of the Legislative Council was writing to the Parole Board almost on a daily basis.
That was the late Terry Roberts, also Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Correctional Services, from the South East and on the Executive Council.
At the end of the day, she was granted parole and Webb was denied.
Would you go so far as to say at times it's a power that's been misused?
I can't say that. I can't speculate on why Executive Council reaches the decision that it does.
And there's no way of finding out.
It isn't a transparent process. They don't publish reasons.
When news of this inequity reached the attention of Justice DeBell, he asked the Parole Board for an explanation.
But it was in fact not us. We'd recommended the release for both of them, but hers was approved and his wasn't.
He then angrily protested to the new Correctional Services Minister, Carmel Zollo.
I respectfully suggest that the situation is not only unfair, but it is also unjust.
Is it normal for a judge to get so involved? Is that normal?
Unusual. But he obviously felt very strongly that it was terribly unfair.
DeBell went on to urge the government to correct the injustice.
I ask that you consider the matter urgently and recommend to the Executive Council that it revoke its decision and release Mr Webb at the earliest possible date.
But a fat lot of regard was shown for Justice DeBell's view. 4 years on, the then Attorney-General Michael Atkinson was bragging by media release of how his government had kept murderers like Michael Webb in jail.
That sort of material, I just think is completely inappropriate.
No mention, of course, that they'd happily released his co-offender, Veronica Hay, 4 years earlier.
Does it make Mr Webb a political hostage?
I don't think I can respond to that question.
Prior to this Labor government, these powers had never been used.
Never.
Never.
No doubt Mike Rann would brag about it, but one of his legacies has been to white ant a pillar of the Westminster system that justice shouldn't be the plaything of politicians.
What does it say about the separation of powers?
What we have at the moment is a government who swings both ways. They can use it as a fallback when it suits them, or they completely disregard it.
It does worry me, though, that it seems to intrude into the separation of powers, and that is a cornerstone of our democratic process. So at a general philosophical level, I do find that disturbing. I've said that before.
Perhaps the new Premier, Jay Weatherill, being a lawyer, will have a more principled approach. In the meantime, Anne Bressington is proposing legislation which puts these decisions back where they belong.
So what this bill does is removes the power of veto from the executive government, and if they want to, if they're not happy with the decision of the Parole Board, they can go through the judicial process and appeal the decision of that Parole Board.
6 days ago, we contacted John Rao, the Attorney-General, for his view on the state's solitary position over the political game-playing parole. Despite 2 calls, we received no response. Still, it's hard to imagine how the state's chief law officer could possibly defend any attack on the separation of powers. Easier just to dodge the questions. Pity. And while, thankfully, very, very few of us will ever be in the position of a Webb or a Hay, the principle, once abandoned, poses a threat to all corners of justice. We already know that if compelling new evidence comes to light after a conviction, the prisoner has to go on bended knees to politicians for a remedy. So far in this state, none have been successful. Good luck if you have to depend on politics for justice.